I woke to the sound of knocking. Faint, deliberate, rhythmic. It wasn't at the front door. No, this came from upstairs, from the second floor of my own home. A dull tapping against wood, steady enough to be human, too erratic to be the wind. My eyes flicked to the clock on my nightstand. 7:14 a.m. Early, too early for anyone else to be awake. My wife, Claire, lay beside me, her side of the bed undisturbed, as if she hadn't slept at all. That was the first sign, the first crack in the morning's fragile illusion. I sat up, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed, listening. Silence. And then voices. Muffled, indistinct, but unmistakable. The floor creaked beneath my weight as I stood. My body felt slow, unwilling, like it already knew what my mind refused to accept. I took one step toward the door, then another. The voices were clearer now. One low and familiar. The other softer, urgent. A woman's voice. Claire's voice. My heartbeat quickened as I ascended the stairs. The second floor hallway stretched before me, the pale morning light filtering through the curtained windows. The door to the guest bedroom stood slightly ajar, just enough to see the sliver of shadowed movement within. A cry. Stifled. Not one of pain, but something else, something worse. I reached out, fingers hovering over the doorknob, my breath trapped in my chest. A choice lay before me. I could turn away, pretend I heard nothing, let the fragile normalcy of my life remain intact for just a few more moments. Or I could open the door. I did not hesitate. The door swung open, revealing everything. Claire, my wife, the woman who had vowed herself to me. She stood at the foot of the guest bed, her body stiff, her face frozen in shock and guilt. And beside her, God help me, stood my father. My father. Time did not stop. It did not slow. If anything, the world sped up, spiraling out of control, hurtling toward a terrible, irreversible conclusion. My father, half-dressed, his expression unreadable, took a step back. Claire said something, words, excuses, meaningless sounds. My vision blurred, blood roaring in my ears. It was not a misunderstanding. There was no explanation that could change what I saw. Betrayal. The ugliest word in any language, heavy with the weight of destruction. I did not shout. I did not weep. Cold rage settled over me like a winter frost, freezing every emotion beneath its weight. I turned and walked away. Not out of forgiveness. Not out of weakness. But because my revenge would be measured, calculated, absolute. And when it came, it would be merciless. The house was quiet, but inside me, a storm raged. I walked down the stairs, each step deliberate, each breath controlled. I had seen enough. More than enough. Claire had followed me, her soft footsteps padding behind mine. She didn't touch me, she wouldn't dare, but I could feel her presence, hovering like a ghost. James, please, she whispered. Let me. I didn't stop. I didn't acknowledge her. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my hand steady, my pulse impossibly calm. Claire was still speaking, her voice a trembling plea, but I had already decided her words meant nothing. I stepped into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water. Not because I was thirsty, not because I needed it, but because I needed a moment to think. Upstairs, my father was still there. The man who raised me. The man who had sat across from me just last night, drinking my whiskey, toasting to my birthday, laughing in my home as if he belonged here. Did he know? Did he know I was awake? That I had seen everything? That his son had just watched his world crumble before him? I hoped he did. A chair scraped against the hardwood floor behind me. Clara had sat down. She wasn't crying, not yet, but I could hear the panic in her breath. I took a slow sip of water. Tasted nothing. Then I turned. Claire flinched at my gaze. She had expected anger, shouting, accusations. She had prepared for a fight. But I wasn't here to fight. I was here to end this. She opened her mouth again, but I lifted a hand, silencing her without a word. Her lips pressed together. She was trembling now, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Good. I set my glass down, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. And then I walked past her toward the front door. I could feel her confusion, her fear. She didn't know what I was going to do. She expected rage, demands, ultimatums. She expected me to break something, to scream. But there was no satisfaction in destruction, no justice in mere fury. I reached for my coat, slipping it over my shoulders with slow, practiced ease. My car keys were in the dish by the door. I picked them up, testing the weight in my palm. Claire stood abruptly, her chair nearly toppling behind her. "James," she said again, firmer now, desperate. "Where are you going?" I ignored her. I opened the door, stepping into the cold morning air, and I walked away. Not because I was defeated, but because the game had just begun. The engine hummed beneath my fingers as I gripped the steering wheel, but I wasn't really driving. Not yet. I sat in my car, parked in front of the house that was no longer my home, staring at nothing. Everything felt distant, detached. I should have felt rage, blinding, all-consuming rage, but instead, all I felt was clarity. There was no saving this. Claire and my father had crossed a line that could never be undone. There was no apology that could erase what I had seen, no explanation that could justify it. They had destroyed something fundamental, something sacred, and for that, they would suffer. I started the car and pulled away from the house. I didn't look back. I drove aimlessly, the early morning roads nearly empty, the city still half asleep. My mind wasn't wandering, though. It was working, calculating, preparing. There were 1,000 ways to ruin a person. Some were loud, some were violent, some were immediate. But the best kind of revenge, the kind that left scars that never faded, was slow, cold, methodical. By the time I reached the edge of town, I had already decided how this would end. I pulled into an empty parking lot and reached for my phone. First, my father. I scrolled through my contacts, past a familiar name that had once meant everything to me. I hovered over it for a moment, then pressed block. He didn't deserve words. He didn't deserve closure. He would spend every day wondering what I would do when I would strike. He would wake up with the weight of uncertainty pressing on his chest, his every moment tainted by the knowledge that I was coming for him. He would never see it coming. I set my phone down and exhaled slowly, feeling a strange calm settle over me. Then I made another call. Not to Claire. Claire was already dead to me. No, this call was to someone else. Someone who would help me dismantle the life she had so carelessly thrown away. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "James." A pause. Then a smile curled at the edge of my lips. "I need your help." The voice on the other end of the line was cautious. "What's going on?" I hadn't spoken to Michael in years. Not because we had fallen out, but because life had pulled us in different directions. But Michael had always been the kind of man you called when things got messy. He understood strategy. He understood patience. He understood revenge. I found out something, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Something that can't be ignored. Michael was silent for a moment. Then he exhaled. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about Claire, about my father, about how they had betrayed me under my own roof. I left nothing out, painting the picture with the precision of a surgeon. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then Michael said, "That's disgusting." "Yes, and you're calling me because—" I looked out at the empty parking lot, my fingers tightening around the phone. "Because I want to make sure they regret it." Another pause. Then a chuckle. That's what I thought. Michael never needed things explained twice. That was why I had called him. "You want to go legal or personal?" he asked. "Both." Good answer. Michael's tone turned serious. "We do this right, James. No outbursts. No stupid mistakes. You want them to suffer, not to make yourself look like a madman." "I know. You have leverage." "Yes." "Good. Then we start with Claire. What's her weakness?" I closed my eyes and thought. Claire had always cared about appearances, about reputation, about the way people saw her. She lived in a world built on the illusion of control, and I was going to take that away from her. "She cares about what people think," I said. "She cares about her image." Michael hummed. "Perfect." My hands clenched into fists. "And my father," Michael sighed. "That's more complicated. He has nothing to lose, James. No wife, no small children. He's an aging man who already had his chance to be a good person, and he threw it away. That makes him dangerous. I don't care. I know you don't, Michael said. But we have to be smart. You want him to feel this every single day, not just once. He was right. A single act of revenge wasn't enough. It needed to last. Michael's voice turned sharp. So we build. We dismantle their lives piece by piece. We take away their comfort. We take away their security. And when we're done, they won't just regret what they did. They'll wish they had never been born. I felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. Yes, that was exactly what I wanted. Michael's voice dropped lower. You ready to play the long game? I smiled. I was born ready. I drove home with a strange sense of peace settling over me. I wasn't lost anymore. I had purpose. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was higher, the world fully awake. Claire's car was still there. Of course it was. Where else would she go? She would be inside, waiting, wondering, dreading. Good. I stepped out, closed the car door softly behind me, and walked up the front steps. When I entered, the house was silent. I didn't call for her. I didn't need to. I moved through the hallway with steady, deliberate steps. She would hear me coming. She would feel the weight of every footfall, each one a reminder of what she had done. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a half-empty cup of coffee. She looked like she hadn't moved since I left. She lifted her head when she saw me, eyes rimmed red. She had been crying. I felt nothing. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She was waiting for me to say something, to yell, to demand an explanation. I did none of those things. Instead, I walked past her and grabbed a folder from the counter. Thick, black, filled with neatly stacked papers. I had printed them this morning before I left. I set it down in front of her. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling. She opened it, scanning the contents. Divorce papers. Her breath hitched. You? Her voice was barely a whisper. You already? Yes. Her hand covered her mouth. James, please. We need to talk. No. She flinched like I had struck her. I watched as her eyes darted across the pages, taking in every carefully worded line. The terms were clear, brutal, undeniable. I was taking everything. The house, the assets, every carefully constructed part of the life she had built. And more importantly, I was taking my daughter. She choked on a sob. This is fair. I finished for her. Her eyes shot up, desperate now. No. No, James, we can fix this. Please. I made a mistake, but I love you. I love our family. I'll do anything. You already did. She paled. I leaned in slightly, my voice ice cold. You don't get to decide how this ends. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But you don't have to do this. I tilted my head. You didn't have to do what you did either. But here we are. She shook her head violently. No. No, James, please. I straightened, adjusting my sleeves. Sign them. Her hands gripped the papers so tightly her knuckles turned white. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I turned and walked toward the stairs. Where are you going? She called out, voice frantic. I didn't answer. Because now it was time to deal with my father. I stood outside my father's house, staring at the door that had once felt like home. It was strange how betrayal could transform something so familiar into something foreign. I had spent years in this house, Christmases, birthdays, quiet Sunday mornings when the world felt still. And yet, standing here now, all I could see was the place where the man who raised me had proven he was nothing more than a fraud. I didn't knock. I had my own key. I stepped inside without hesitation, the door clicking shut behind me. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of a television murmuring from the living room. He was here. I moved through the hallway, my footsteps measured, my breathing calm. I wasn't here to rage. I wasn't here to shout. I was here to end this. My father was sitting in his chair, reclined slightly, half watching a morning news broadcast. He didn't look up when I entered. Maybe he thought I was someone else. Maybe he thought he still had time before he had to face me. He was wrong. I stopped in front of him, blocking his view of the screen. He looked up then, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he sighed and reached for the remote, muting the television. I suppose you're here to talk, he said. I didn't respond. His eyes flicked to the side, as if searching for an escape from this moment, but there was none. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice quieter when he spoke again. I made a mistake, James. I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. A mistake. Yes. Tell me, I said, tilting my head. When did it start? He hesitated. Wrong move. I took a step closer, my voice sharp. Don't lie to me. His jaw tightened. A few months ago. Months. So it hadn't been a lapse in judgment. It had been deliberate. Repeated. Calculated. My hands curled into fists at my sides, but I didn't move. I didn't lash out. I just let the weight of his confession settle between us. Did you ever feel guilty? I asked. He swallowed. Yes. Then why didn't you stop? His face twisted, his gaze falling to the floor. I don't have an excuse. No, I agreed. You don't. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then I pulled a small envelope from my jacket and tossed it onto the coffee table. He looked at it, then back at me. What's this? He asked. Your future. He hesitated, then picked it up and slid out the contents. His expression darkened as he read. It was everything. Bank statements, emails, phone records, proof of his betrayal, meticulously gathered. Evidence that, if released, would ruin him. His personal life, his career, his reputation. It was all in my hands now. His grip on the papers tightened. James. I met his gaze, my voice low and even. You will pack your things. You will leave town. You will never contact me again. He flinched. You can't be serious. I am. His eyes searched mine, looking for something, mercy maybe. Forgiveness. He found nothing. If you don't, I continued, I'll release everything. And I promise you, I'll make sure you lose everything the way I did. He exhaled slowly, his face lined with something that almost looked like regret. But I didn't care. I turned toward the door. James, he called out. I didn't stop. I never wanted to hurt you. I paused, just for a second. Then, without looking back, I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. Let him sit with his guilt. Let him drown in it. I was done here. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check my phone. I just let the silence settle around me, the weight of what I had done pressing against my chest. My father would leave. He had no choice. I had taken away any illusion of power he thought he had over me. And yet I felt nothing. No relief. No satisfaction. Only emptiness. But I wasn't finished. Claire was still in the house when I arrived. The divorce papers were untouched on the kitchen table. She hadn't signed them yet. I wasn't surprised. She was standing by the sink, staring blankly out the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She must have heard me come in, but she didn't turn around. I walked past her, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, twisted off the cap. Then finally she spoke. You went to see him. It wasn't a question. I took a sip, letting the silence stretch between us. She turned, her eyes searching mine. What did you do? I set the bottle down. What needed to be done? Her breath hitched, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her expression. Not fear of me. Fear of what I had set in motion. James, I raised a hand, stopping her. Don't. Her mouth snapped shut. I picked up the divorce papers and placed them back in front of her. Sign them. She didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she whispered, Is there really no way back from this? I exhaled slowly. No. Tears welled in her eyes. I love you. I tilted my head slightly, studying her. She was good at this. At pretending she was fragile. At playing the part of the broken woman who had simply made a mistake. But I had seen the truth. You don't love me, I said quietly. You love control. You love security. You love the comfort I gave you. She let out a soft, shuddering breath. I never meant to hurt you. I smiled then. A small, bitter smile. But you did. She wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers. Then finally, hesitantly, she reached for the pen. Her hand hovered over the paper for a long moment before she signed her name. A part of me expected to feel something then. Some kind of closure. Some finality. I felt nothing. I took the papers, folded them neatly, and placed them back in the folder. Claire looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? I met her gaze, my voice steady and motionless. Now you leave. Claire didn't move. She sat there, staring at me, her breath shallow, her fingers still resting on the pen she had just used to sign away our marriage. You can't mean that, she whispered. I said nothing. She shook her head slowly, her voice trembling. James, where would I even go? That's not my problem. She flinched, her hands gripping the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. This is my home, too. Not anymore. I slid the folder under my arm and turned away, walking toward the stairs. I had nothing left to say to her. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood. James, please. We can work through this. I stopped at the foot of the stairs and turned my head slightly. You already made your choice, Claire. Her lip trembled, her hands clenching at her sides. She wanted to fight. She wanted to plead. But she knew it was pointless. I climbed the stairs, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. It took her 2 hours to pack a bag. I heard her moving around the house, opening drawers, pulling things from closets. She was slow, hesitant, as if she thought dragging it out would somehow change my mind. It wouldn't. By the time she finally came downstairs, I was sitting in the living room, waiting. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. Her voice was small. Are you really going to let me walk out of here? I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. You walked out first. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. She let out a broken breath, nodded slightly, then turned toward the door. I didn't follow her. I didn't watch as she stepped outside. I only listened to the sound of the door closing behind her. And then, finally, I was alone. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I pulled out my phone and dialed Michael. He answered immediately. It's done. Yes, I said. Claire's gone. Michael let out a low hum of approval. Good. And your father? He'll leave. Michael was silent for a moment. Then his voice darkened. You don't sound satisfied. I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against my temple. Because I'm not. I had torn him out of my life. I had destroyed the illusion of security they had wrapped themselves in. I had taken away everything they thought they could get away with keeping. But I still wanted more. Michael seemed to understand. Then we take the next step. I leaned back into the couch, my grip tightening on the phone. Tell me what to do. Michael didn't hesitate. If you want to make sure they never recover, you have to hit them where it hurts the most. I listened silent, my fingers tightening around the phone. Claire thrives on reputation, he continued. Your father thrives on status. Take those away, and they won't just lose what they have, they'll lose who they are. I had already taken away Claire's home, her security. But she still had her social circle, the carefully constructed image she had spent years maintaining. That wouldn't last. And my father, he had built his name on trust, on influence. The world saw him as a man of wisdom, someone respected, someone admired. That too would end. I exhaled slowly. How do we start? Michael's voice was steady, precise. We expose them. We let everyone see them for what they really are. I nodded to myself. I already have everything I need. The evidence, the messages, the photos, the proof of their betrayal. I wasn't going to be the only one who knew. Michael's voice was calm, calculated. You need to time this right. One misstep, and they'll try to spin it. But if you control the narrative, they won't have anywhere to run. I knew exactly how to do it. I pulled my laptop onto my lap, opened a blank email draft. I attached the files, every piece of evidence gathered, every carefully documented betrayal. And then I typed the recipient list. Claire's friends, her colleagues, the people who believed she was someone she wasn't. For my father, I chose his associates, his business partners, the people who trusted him, who respected him, who still thought he was a man of integrity. I let my fingers hover over the keyboard for a moment. Then, with a single click, I sent it. There was no turning back now. Michael let out a low chuckle on the other end of the line. It's done. Yes. He exhaled, satisfied. Now we watched them burn. I sat there, staring at the screen, my heartbeat steady. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. But it wasn't over yet. Now I waited for the fallout. And when it came, I would be ready. The fallout was immediate. It started with Claire. By the afternoon, my phone buzzed with messages from mutual friends, all variations of the same stunned reaction. Is this real? Did Claire really do this? I can't believe it. Her carefully built world cracked within hours. The women she had called her closest friends, the ones who prided themselves on being morally superior, turned on her. They didn't defend her. They didn't sympathize. They condemned her. Screenshots of my emails spread like wildfire through her social circles. A few had the nerve to ask her directly if it was true. Claire tried to fight back to control the damage, but there was nothing left to salvage. Her professional reputation took an even greater hit. She worked in a field that thrived on image, on perception. She had positioned herself as a woman of principle, of family values. Now all they saw was a liar, a woman who had betrayed her husband with his own father. The job she had once loved, gone. She wasn't fired, not officially. But the cold stares, the hushed whispers, the sudden exclusion from meetings, it was only a matter of time. I received one last email from her. Just one sentence. Why did you have to ruin my life? I didn't reply. Because she had ruined mine first. Then came my father. Unlike Claire, he didn't have a group of friends who whispered behind his back. He had something worse, business partners. People who depended on trust, on loyalty. And now they saw him for what he truly was. The emails I had sent spread through his professional circles, quiet at first, then louder. Investors hesitated. Clients pulled out. The company he had spent years building, a legacy he had hoped to pass down, crumbled under the weight of scandal. Within a week, he stepped down from his position. The official statement cited personal matters. Everyone knew better. My mother, whom he had left years ago for another woman, found out through mutual acquaintances. She called me once. Not to comfort me, not to check on me, but to say I always knew he'd ruin himself one day. I hung up without responding. And just like that, my father became a man with nothing. Claire, a woman with nowhere to go. I had taken everything from them. And yet, as I sat alone in my house, the silence pressing in, I realized something. Revenge had been satisfying, but it wasn't fulfilling. I had burned their lives to the ground, but mine was still standing, hollow and quiet. The betrayal was over. The war had been won. Now I had to figure out what came next. I picked up my phone and called Michael. He answered immediately. It's done. Yes, I said. It's done. There was a long pause. Then his voice softened. So what now? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, I was ready to find one. And I would. Alone. Then.